Go ahead, Ethan Caldwell said with a smirk, swirling the last inch of bourbon in his crystal glass. Give me one piece of financial advice, something actually useful, and I might even double your tip. The table erupted in low, polished laughter, the kind that lived comfortably in rooms where money replaced manners and arrogance wore a tailored suit. The private dining lounge on the 42nd floor overlooked Manhattan like a kingdom of glass and steel, city lights flickering beneath them like obedient stars, and inside, the air carried the scent of oak, citrus, and quiet dominance. Naomi Brooks didn't react, not when the laughter rolled across the table, not when a man in a navy suit glanced at her like she was part of the furniture, not even when Ethan leaned back in his chair, confident, untouchable, expecting nothing more than silence from the woman holding a tray of imported wine. She simply stood there, posture steady, fingers balanced perfectly around the stem of a glass, her expression calm in a way that didn't belong in a room designed to intimidate. Naomi had been working double shifts for weeks, her black uniform pressed sharp, her movements precise, her presence nearly invisible unless summoned. But invisibility had its advantages. It allowed her to hear everything. Every number casually thrown around like spare change, every acquisition discussed between bites of steak, every confident prediction about markets, mergers, and millions. Tonight was no different, except for one thing. Ethan Caldwell was about to make a decision. He tapped his glass lightly with his finger, drawing attention back to himself, his voice smooth, practiced, the kind that had closed deals worth more than most people would see in a lifetime. We're locking the deal tomorrow morning, he said, nodding toward the man across from him. $480 million acquisition, fast expansion, aggressive leverage, we dominate within 12 months. Heads nodded instantly, not because they fully agreed, but because disagreeing with a man like Ethan wasn't a risk anyone in that room was paid to take. Naomi stepped forward to refill his glass, her movements quiet, deliberate, her eyes flicking once. Just once, to the document resting beside his hand, numbers highlighted, projections bold, assumptions buried where only someone paying attention would notice. She saw it in less than 2 seconds. Not the entire picture, not every variable, but enough. Enough to know something didn't add up. Enough to feel that subtle tension beneath the surface, the kind that most people ignored because confidence was louder than caution. Ethan watched her for a moment longer than necessary, amused by his own joke, by the idea that someone like her could even understand what he was discussing. Well, he pressed, raising an eyebrow, the corners of his mouth still curled in quiet entertainment. You heard me. Any advice? The room stilled, just slightly, the laughter fading into expectation, not because they thought she would answer, but because the possibility itself felt absurd enough to be interesting. Naomi placed the bottle down gently on the table, the soft clink barely audible against the hum of the city below, and for the first time, she met his eyes fully. There was no challenge in her gaze, no defiance, just clarity, the kind that came from seeing something others had missed. For a brief second, it almost looked like she might say nothing, like she would let the moment pass the way moments like this always did, swallowed by hierarchy and assumption. But then her lips parted, and her voice, when it came, was calm, steady, and completely unshaken. If you sign that deal tomorrow, she said, her tone measured, almost gentle, you won't dominate in 12 months. You'll be trying to recover what's left in 6. The words didn't echo, they didn't need to, because the silence that followed was heavier than any reaction, thicker than the laughter that had filled the room just seconds before. No one moved. No one spoke. Even the city outside seemed to pause, as if waiting to see what Ethan Caldwell would do next. He didn't smile this time. He didn't lean back. He didn't dismiss her. He just looked at her, really looked at her, as if trying to understand how a waitress in a pressed black uniform had just said the one thing no one else in the room had dared to consider. The paper did not argue back, it never did, but it revealed everything to the man who finally chose to see it. And as Ethan Caldwell's eyes moved across the numbers for the second time, then a third, something subtle began to shift in his expression, not panic, not doubt, but recognition, the kind that arrives quietly and settles heavily, like a truth that had been waiting just beneath the surface all along. His fingers slowed as he turned another page, the soft rustle of paper echoing louder than it should have in a room that had forgotten how to speak. Across the table, the executive who had earlier nodded without question now leaned forward, his brow tightening as he followed the same trail Naomi had just laid out in a few measured sentences, his confidence fading into careful calculation. That integration timeline, the man said cautiously, almost to himself. We assumed operational overlap would offset the initial cost pressure. Ethan did not look up. We assumed wrong, he replied, his voice quiet but firm, no longer performing for anyone in the room, no longer concerned with maintaining the illusion of certainty. The statement landed differently than anything he had said before, not as a declaration of power, but as an admission of reality, and that alone was enough to make the atmosphere shift again. Naomi remained still, her presence unchanged, her role in the room technically the same, yet everything about the way she was being perceived had altered in ways no uniform could contain. One of the younger associates, who had barely spoken all night, leaned toward the table, his eyes moving quickly between the projections and Ethan's reaction. If the cost of capital continues trending upward, he said carefully, then the leverage ratio becomes unsustainable much faster than we modeled. Ethan nodded once, a small movement, but decisive. Not just faster, he said, finally lifting his gaze, not to the associate, but back to Naomi, inevitably. The word hung in the air, undeniable, reshaping the entire conversation without raising its volume. A few seconds passed, then another, and in that silence, something rare unfolded, the kind of moment that does not belong to spreadsheets or boardrooms, but to clarity, to the instant when power is forced to listen instead of speak. Ethan set the document down slowly, aligning it with the edge of the table as if restoring order to something that had just been disrupted. "Where did you learn to see that?" he asked, his tone stripped of ego, replaced with something far more difficult to carry, respect that had not been planned. Naomi did not answer immediately, not out of hesitation, but because she understood the weight of the question, the shift behind it, the unspoken acknowledgement that came with it. She glanced briefly at the skyline beyond the glass, the city still alive, still moving, still unaware of the quiet reversal taking place high above it. Then she looked back at him. "I used to study it," she said simply. No elaboration, no defense, no attempt to impress, just a fact delivered without decoration. The room absorbed it slowly, as if unsure how to process something that did not fit into the categories they were used to assigning. Ethan's eyes held hers for a moment longer, searching for more, for context, for a narrative that would make it easier to understand how someone standing beside a table with a serving tray could dismantle a multi-million-dollar strategy in under a minute, but Naomi offered nothing beyond what she had already given. She did not need to explain her past to validate her present. That, more than anything else, unsettled the room in a way no argument could. One of the men shifted in his seat, clearing his throat as if to bring the conversation back to something familiar, something controlled. "So what are you suggesting?" he asked, directing the question toward Ethan, but his eyes flickered toward Naomi, unable to ignore the source of the disruption. Ethan did not answer right away. Instead, he leaned back slightly, his posture no longer relaxed, but recalibrated, his mind moving through possibilities that had not existed for him just minutes earlier. Then, quietly, without breaking eye contact with the woman who had changed the trajectory of the night, he said, "I am suggesting we stop pretending we already know everything." And for the first time since the dinner began, no one laughed. Glanced once more at the projections, then toward Naomi, and something in his expression shifted again, not uncertainty, but openness, a rare adjustment for someone who had built his reputation on knowing exactly what to do. "I would start by questioning the assumptions," he said slowly, his voice measured, deliberate, all of them. The room absorbed it, the simplicity of the answer carrying more weight than any complex strategy they had discussed earlier. A younger analyst, encouraged by the shift in tone, leaned forward. "Then we need a revised model," he said, his voice steadier than before, one that accounts for current capital costs, integration delays, and downside scenarios. Ethan nodded once. "Tonight," he said. "Not tomorrow, not next week, but now," as if the urgency had finally aligned with reality. A subtle ripple moved through the group. Not panic, but motion, the kind that comes when direction replaces assumption. Naomi stepped back slightly, giving space as the table began to reorganize itself, laptops opening, documents shifting, the conversation transforming from performance into work. But even as the room moved, Ethan remained still for a moment longer, his eyes returning to her, not out of habit, but with intention. "You said you used to study it," he said, his tone quieter now, almost private despite the room around them. "Why did you stop?" It was not a challenge, not a test, but a question that carried genuine curiosity, something far more difficult to fake. Naomi held his gaze for a second, just long enough to acknowledge it, then looked down briefly, as if measuring how much of the truth belonged in a room like this. "Sometimes," she said softly, "opportunity does not follow preparation." The sentence was simple, but it carried years within it, unspoken, unadvertised, yet impossible to ignore. Ethan did not respond immediately. He did not offer a solution, did not make a promise, did not attempt to correct what he had not yet fully understood. Instead, he sat with it, letting the meaning settle in the same way her earlier words had, quietly, completely. Around them, the room continued to shift, strategies being rewritten, assumptions questioned, decisions delayed. But at the center of it all, something more fundamental had already changed, something no contract could capture. Because that night was no longer about a deal. It was about who had the clarity to see the truth, and who finally had the humility to listen. The room did not return to what it had been. It could not, because once a truth like that enters a space built on assumption, it does not leave quietly. It rewrites the rules, and as the soft glow of laptop screens began to replace the polished reflection of untouched glasses, the atmosphere shifted from performance to precision. Numbers were no longer spoken with casual confidence. They were questioned, dissected, recalculated in real time, and the same voices that had once echoed certainty now carried a careful restraint, as if each word had to earn its place. Ethan Caldwell stood slowly, not to dominate the room, but to see it from a different angle, his hands resting lightly on the back of his chair as his eyes moved across the table, observing not just the data, but the people, the reactions, the subtle recalibrations happening in every seat. "Run the downside scenario with a 5% increase in capital costs," he said, his tone steady, grounded, "and stretch the integration timeline by 90 days. The analyst nearest to him nodded quickly, fingers already moving across the keyboard, the sharp clicks filling the silence that no longer felt empty, but focused. Naomi had stepped back toward the edge of the room, her role once again blending into the background, yet nothing about her presence felt unnoticed anymore. She adjusted a glass, aligned a plate, small actions that carried the same quiet precision as her words, as if attention to detail was not something she turned on, but something she lived with. From where she stood, she could see the reflection of the table in the window, the city lights framing the scene like a second audience, and in that reflection, she saw something most people in the room did not, the moment when confidence becomes awareness. "This does not hold," one of the partners said suddenly, his voice tighter now, pointing at the revised numbers on his screen. "If the margin compresses at that rate, we are exposed within 2 quarters. Another voice followed, then another, each layer of analysis peeling back what had once looked like certainty, revealing a structure far more fragile than anyone had been willing to admit earlier. Ethan listened without interrupting, his attention moving between the screens and the faces, absorbing the shift, allowing it to unfold completely. Then, quietly, he spoke again. "Pause the acquisition," he said. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of a decision that would ripple far beyond the room. And for a moment, no one responded, not because they disagreed, but because they understood exactly what it meant. Walking away from a deal like that was not just a financial adjustment. It was a statement, one that would be noticed, questioned, analyzed by markets and competitors alike. "We reassess," Ethan continued, his voice firm now, not with ego, but with clarity. "We rebuild the model from the ground up, and we do not move forward until it holds under pressure." The room shifted again, this time with direction, with purpose, the kind that replaces hesitation with action. Naomi turned slightly, preparing to step away completely, to return to the rhythm of her work, The quiet flow of service that had defined her role before this night changed its shape. But before she could move, Ethan's voice stopped her, not loud, not commanding, but intentional. Naomi. It was the first time he had said her name, not as a label, but as recognition. She paused, looking back at him, her expression unchanged, but her attention fully present. Stay, he said, after a brief second, choosing the word carefully, aware of everything it carried. It was not an order. It was an invitation, one that shifted the space between them in a way no title or position ever could. The room noticed, not openly, not dramatically, but in the subtle way eyes flicker, in the way posture adjusts when something unspoken becomes understood. Naomi hesitated for the smallest moment, not out of uncertainty, but out of awareness, of where she stood, of what this meant, of the line that had just been crossed not by her, but by the room itself. Then she gave a slight nod, stepping forward just enough to remain part of the conversation without claiming it. And in that quiet movement, the balance shifted again, not through force, not through volume, but through something far more powerful, the recognition that the person they had overlooked was now the one they could not afford to ignore. The word lingered longer than anyone expected, not because it was loud, but because it carried something unfamiliar in that room, an equal weight placed on a name that had not mattered just an hour ago. And as Naomi stepped slightly closer to the table, the subtle shift became undeniable, not announced, not formalized, but felt by everyone present. Ethan Caldwell did not look away this time, not even as the analysts continued adjusting projections, their voices now quieter, more deliberate, as if every calculation had to pass a new standard. Walk me through the exposure again, he said, his tone focused, but his attention divided, part of him still tracking the movement of the woman who had changed the direction of his decision with a single sentence. The analyst complied, outlining revised numbers, adjusted timelines, and potential risk points, but something in the explanation lacked the clarity that had defined Naomi's earlier insight, and Ethan noticed. He did not interrupt immediately. He let the explanation unfold, let the numbers stack, let the logic attempt to rebuild itself. But when the analyst paused, expecting agreement, Ethan's response came without hesitation. You are still assuming stability where there is none, he said calmly, his gaze shifting, not to the screen, but to Naomi. It was not a test. It was an acknowledgement. The room followed his line of sight, not dramatically, but enough to make the shift visible. Naomi remained composed, her hands resting lightly at her sides, her posture unchanged, but her presence now carried a different gravity, one that no longer needed introduction. The model is reacting, she said quietly, stepping just enough into the light for her voice to land clearly. But it is not anticipating. The distinction was small in words, but vast in meaning, and the analysts paused, recalibrating, adjusting their approach in real time. Ethan nodded slightly, absorbing it, building on it. Then we stop reacting, he said, his voice steady, aligned, and we start anticipating. The sentence moved through the room like a reset, not dramatic, but decisive, shifting the direction of thought from defense to strategy. One of the partners leaned forward, his earlier confidence replaced with something more measured. So what are we missing? He asked, the question no longer rhetorical, no longer directed solely at Ethan, but open, searching. Naomi did not rush to answer. She looked at the screen briefly, at the numbers, the assumptions, the structure that had been built with confidence and was now being carefully dismantled. You are scaling based on past performance, she said, her tone even. But the market is not repeating itself. It is correcting. And when it does, leverage becomes pressure, not power. The words settled into the room with the same quiet force as before, and this time, no one needed time to understand them. They felt it immediately. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly, not in resistance, but in recognition of how close he had come to overlooking something that now seemed obvious. And the timeline? He asked, his voice lower, more focused, as if narrowing in on the exact point of failure. Naomi met his gaze, steady, unflinching. It breaks first, she said. Because time is the one variable you cannot negotiate once the market decides otherwise. The simplicity of it cut through the complexity they had been hiding behind, reducing a multi-layered strategy into a single vulnerability that could not be ignored. The room fell into a different kind of silence now, not the fragile tension from before, but a concentrated stillness, the kind that comes when people are no longer pretending to understand, but actually trying to. Ethan exhaled slowly, a controlled release, then turned slightly toward the table. "Rebuild it," he said, his voice firm, grounded, "from the assumption that the market moves against us." The instruction landed immediately, fingers moving, screens updating, the entire room, adjusting to a new baseline that had not existed before Naomi spoke. She stepped back again, not retreating, but allowing the process to continue without her occupying the center of it. And yet, even as she returned to the edge of the space, nothing about her presence felt peripheral anymore. Ethan watched that movement, the quiet return to a role that no longer defined her, and something in his expression shifted again, not just respect now, but awareness of how easily value is overlooked when it does not arrive in the form you expect. And in that moment, as the room worked to correct a decision that could have cost them everything, one truth settled deeper than any number on the screen, that the most important voice in the room had been the one they almost never heard at all. The momentum in the room did not slow. It sharpened, like a blade finally aligned with its purpose. And as the revised models began to take shape across glowing screens, something deeper than strategy was unfolding, something that could not be measured in percentages or projections. Ethan Caldwell moved around the table slowly, not with the urgency of a man chasing a deal, but with the awareness of someone recalibrating how he saw everything in front of him, from the numbers on the screen to the people behind them. The analysts worked with a new intensity now, their voices lower, more precise, no longer echoing assumptions but testing them, challenging them, building something that could actually hold under pressure. "Run the stress scenario again," Ethan said, pausing behind one of the laptops, his eyes scanning the updated figures. "Push it further this time. Assume volatility spikes higher than expected." The analyst nodded, adjusting the inputs, and within seconds, the model shifted again, numbers tightening, margins narrowing, the illusion of safety stripped away layer by layer. Across the room, one of the senior partners exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair as the reality settled in. "We were not just aggressive," he said quietly, almost to himself. "We were exposed." No one corrected him. No one softened it. Because for the first time that night, no one was trying to protect their pride. Naomi stood near the edge of the table, her presence steady, her attention still, not inserting herself into the process, but watching it unfold with the same quiet clarity that had brought them here. She did not need to lead the conversation to shape it. That had already been done. Ethan turned slightly, his gaze finding her again, not out of habit now, but out of recognition, the kind that changes how a person is seen, not just in a moment, but moving forward. "If we had not caught this tonight," he said, his voice calm, but carrying the weight of what could have been, "we would have walked straight into it." Naomi did not nod, did not confirm. She simply held his gaze for a second, letting the truth of that statement stand on its own. The room absorbed it in silence, each person running the same thought through their mind, calculating not just the financial cost, but the impact, the headlines, the questions that would have followed. One of the younger analysts glanced up, his expression no longer uncertain, but sharpened by what he had just witnessed. "We need a different framework," he said, his voice steady. "One that accounts for instability as a constant, not an exception." Ethan nodded once, decisive. "Then build it," he replied, his tone grounded. "From that assumption." The directive moved through the room with clarity, replacing hesitation with purpose, and as the team adjusted again, something else became clear, something no one said out loud, but everyone understood, that the foundation they had relied on before was no longer enough. Naomi stepped slightly to the side, allowing space as one of the analysts reached across the table, but even in that small movement, her presence remained central, not because she demanded it, but because it had been earned. Ethan watched her for a moment longer, then spoke again, his voice quieter now, carrying a different kind of weight. "You saw it in seconds," he said, not as a question, but as a realization, what we missed after weeks. There was no accusation in his tone, only acknowledgement, and beneath it, something else, something closer to respect than he had ever offered anyone in a position like hers. Naomi looked at the screen briefly, then back at him, her expression unchanged, her voice calm. Sometimes, she said softly, when you are not trying to prove you are right, you can actually see what is wrong. The words landed with a quiet precision, cutting through the remaining layers of ego that still lingered in the room. No one argued. No one dismissed it. Because they all knew, in different ways, that she was right. Ethan exhaled slowly, a small release of tension he had not even realized he was carrying, then straightened slightly, his posture shifting back into something more familiar, but not unchanged. Keep working, he said to the room, his voice steady. We are not done yet. The analysts nodded, returning to their screens, refining, rebuilding, recalculating, but the energy had changed completely, no longer driven by confidence alone, but by awareness, by the understanding that being right was not enough if you were not willing to question yourself. And as the city lights continued to flicker beyond the glass, indifferent to the quiet transformation happening above them, one truth settled deeper into the room than any number they could calculate, that insight does not ask for permission to exist, and the moment you recognize it, everything else has to change. The numbers kept changing, but the truth did not. It only became clearer, sharper, more difficult to ignore, and as the revised model stabilized under pressure, something else began to settle in the room, something quieter than success, but far more valuable: understanding. Ethan Caldwell stood still for a moment, watching the final scenario load across the screen, the projections no longer fragile, no longer built on optimism alone, but grounded, tested, real. Run it one more time, he said, not out of doubt, but out of discipline. And when the analyst executed the command, the results held, not perfectly, not without risk, but with integrity. That was enough. A slow exhale moved through the table, not relief, but recognition of how close they had come to getting it wrong. One of the partners leaned back, shaking his head slightly, a quiet disbelief in his expression. We would have signed this tomorrow, he said, his voice low, almost reflective, and no one would have questioned it. No one disagreed, because that was the truth they had all been part of. Ethan's gaze shifted again, not to the screen this time, but to Naomi, who remained near the edge of the room, her presence unchanged, her posture still composed, as if the outcome of a multi-million-dollar decision had nothing to do with her, even though it had everything to do with what she had seen first. You did not hesitate, he said, his voice calm, but carrying something deeper now, something closer to respect than authority. Most people in this room would have. Naomi looked at him, not defensive, not proud, just steady. Most people in this room, she replied softly, have something to protect. The words landed without accusation, without judgment, but they revealed something that no model could capture: the quiet pressure that shapes decisions long before they are made. Ethan absorbed it without interruption, his expression tightening just enough to show that he understood exactly what she meant. Around them, the room had begun to slow, not because the work was done, but because the direction was clear. Laptops remained open, but the urgency had shifted into precision, the kind that comes after clarity replaces confusion. One of the analysts saved the updated model, his fingers pausing for a second, as if acknowledging the weight of what had just been corrected. We are stable under this structure, he said, his voice steady. Not invincible, but resilient. Ethan nodded once. That is the goal, he replied, not chasing perfection, but grounding the strategy in reality. The room accepted it, not as a compromise, but as a recalibration of what success actually meant. Naomi turned slightly, her attention moving back toward her responsibilities, the quiet rhythm of service waiting for her to return. But before she could step away, Ethan spoke again, his voice lower now, more personal, carrying none of the distance it had earlier. You said opportunity does not follow preparation, he said, his eyes holding hers. But tonight, it found you anyway. Naomi paused, just for a second, her expression unchanged, but something in her gaze softened, not in vulnerability, but in acknowledgement. No, she said gently. Tonight, I just chose not to ignore what I saw. The distinction was subtle, but it shifted the meaning entirely, placing the power not in circumstance, but in decision. Ethan held that for a moment, then gave a slight nod, not as a gesture of agreement, but as recognition. The room around them had quieted again, not from tension, but from completion, the kind that follows a turning point, when something irreversible has already happened. One of the partners stood, adjusting his jacket, his posture no longer carrying the same effortless certainty it had at the beginning of the night. "We will reconvene in the morning," he said, his tone measured, with the revised strategy. Ethan did not respond immediately. Instead, he stepped back from the table, his attention still on Naomi, as if the most important part of the night had not been the decision they avoided, but the perspective they gained. "Make sure the model reflects everything we discussed," he said finally, his voice steady. Then after a brief pause, he added, "Everything." The word carried more meaning than the instruction required, and those who heard it understood. Naomi gave a small nod, not as an employee, but as someone whose presence had already altered the outcome, and as she turned to step away, the room did not return to what it had been before she spoke. Because some moments do not end when the conversation stops, they continue, quietly, in the way people see, think, and decide long after the night is over. And in that room, high above a city that never paused, one truth remained, clear and unshaken, that insight does not need permission, it only needs someone willing to speak when it matters most. The room emptied slowly, not with the usual ease of a successful dinner, but with the quiet weight of something that had shifted beneath the surface, something none of them could quite name, but all of them felt. Chairs moved back with softer sounds. Glasses remained half full, untouched, as if the appetite for celebration had been replaced by something more reflective. Outside, the city continued without interruption, headlights tracing lines through the night, unaware that in one room above it, a decision had been undone before it could become a mistake. Ethan Caldwell remained where he was, standing at the edge of the table, his eyes no longer on the screens, no longer on the documents, but on the space Naomi had just stepped away from. It was a small space, nothing remarkable about it, and yet it carried the imprint of the most important moment of the night. One by one, the others left, their voices quieter than when they arrived, their confidence replaced not by doubt, but by awareness. They would return in the morning with a better model, a stronger plan, a safer strategy, but they would also return with something else, the memory of being wrong in a room where they had expected to be right. And that memory would stay longer than any number they had just corrected. Naomi moved through the final steps of her shift with the same quiet precision she had always carried, clearing glasses, aligning settings, restoring the room to its original order, but the room itself was no longer the same. Not to her, and not to the man who still had not left. Ethan watched her for a moment before speaking, not with the tone of a CEO addressing staff, but with the measured calm of someone choosing his words carefully. "You saw what all of us missed," he said, his voice steady, without performance, without distance. Naomi did not stop what she was doing. She placed a glass on the tray, adjusted its position slightly, then looked at him, her expression composed, unchanged. "I saw what you were not looking for," she replied softly. The distinction was small, but it carried the same clarity as everything she had said before. Ethan nodded once, absorbing it, not challenging it, not reframing it, just letting it stand as truth. He took a step closer, not imposing, not closing distance in a way that demanded anything, but in a way that acknowledged it. "What are you doing here?" he asked, not dismissively, not rhetorically, but genuinely, the question that had been building since the moment she spoke. Naomi held his gaze for a second, then glanced briefly around the room, now quiet, now empty of the voices that had filled it earlier. "Working," she said simply. Ethan exhaled, a quiet breath that carried more than the word deserved, because he understood what she was choosing not to say. "You should not be," he replied, not as an order, not as a judgment, but as an observation shaped by everything he had just witnessed. Naomi did not argue. She did not agree. She simply lifted the tray, her movements steady, grounded in something that did not shift with a single night, no matter how significant that night had been. "Sometimes," she said, her voice calm, "where you are is not where you belong, but it is where you are needed." The words settled into the space between them, not dramatic, not heavy, but complete. Ethan stood still, letting that settle, realizing that what he had seen was not an exception, not a moment of luck or coincidence, but the result of something deeper, something that had existed long before he noticed it. He reached into his pocket, then stopped, his hand still for a brief second, as if reconsidering the gesture before it even began. This was not a transaction. It could not be reduced to one. Instead, he let his hand fall back to his side, choosing something else, something less familiar but more honest. "Come by my office tomorrow," he said, his tone even, not commanding, not persuasive, just open. "We should continue this conversation." Naomi looked at him, not surprised, not impressed, just aware, measuring the moment for what it was and what it was not. "Maybe," she said quietly, not as a promise, not as a refusal, but as a possibility she would decide on her own terms. Ethan gave a slight nod, accepting that answer without pushing further, understanding for the first time that not every opportunity is his to define. Naomi turned, stepping toward the exit, her figure moving through the soft light toward a door that led back to a world that had not changed, even if this one had. Ethan remained where he was, watching until she disappeared from view, and in that stillness, one truth settled deeper than any deal he had ever closed. That power can command attention, but it cannot create insight. And the moment you learn to listen instead of assume, everything you thought you owned begins to look very